make the most of your webinar experience. We love it when the attendees are engaged with the webinar. You can certainly use Twitter to do that. You can also use the GoToWebinar application to ask questions via chat, and we will answer every question that gets asked. So we definitely encourage you to ask questions, submit comments, all of those sorts of things using the chat feature. We are not going to have any polls during this particular webinar, but like I said, we will be engaging with attendees on Twitter, so we encourage you to use that method. Please focus during the webinar if you can. Try to avoid multitasking. We have a lot of information to cover in the webinar today, and we're going to move through it pretty quickly. So you may just miss the best part if you're not paying attention. And then finally, we get asked this a lot, and all of our webinars, both the PowerPoint and the recording, are published. We publish our PowerPoints to SlideShare, and those slides will be going up later today. And the webinar is posted to our YouTube channel. And both of those can be accessed, and our entire archive of webinars can be accessed at our website, communityit.com. A little bit about Community IT. We are a firm that's been around for over 20 years, and our mission is to help nonprofits solve their strategic and day-to-day IT challenges. Our mission is to help nonprofits use technology more effectively to accomplish their mission. And it's something that we're committed to and very passionate about. Some of the things that make us a little bit different from your average IT support provider is that our approach is strategic. It's collaborative, so we work internally as a collaborative team, and we also prefer to collaborate with the organizations that we support. We're deeply invested in the nonprofit community, and we've worked with over 900 nonprofits since 1993. So I'm going to turn it over now to Steve and Matt, who are going to take it from here.
Great, thanks a lot, Johan. My name is Matt Eshelman. I'm the Chief Technology Officer. I've got my nice mugshot on there. Please feel free to follow me on Twitter or send email questions to me as they come to you. And Steve is joining us as well as our project manager at Community IT. And so I'll turn it over to Steve to talk through our agenda and get us started today.
Thanks, Matt. Today we're going to be talking briefly about the big picture. Actually, this is not an insignificant part of our presentation today. We want to make sure that we frame security in the right way. Matt's going to talk a bit about security culture and kind of what different how policies can impact the way IT security is handled by your organization. Then we'll be covering what I think is probably what people are looking forward to the most, which is our best practices, and then we'll have time at the end for questions.
And we did get quite a few questions as part of the registration process, and I think that we're going to cover quite a bit of that during the session. So if you ask a question as part of the registration process, we'll probably get to it, and if not, go ahead and just chat it in, and we'll be sure to respond to that as we go through. So I think whenever we talk about security, there's just a lot of different things that get put under this umbrella, and I think particularly in the news, there's been a lot of sensational security vulnerabilities that have been identified in the last 6 months. I think Heartbleed was the first one where it really kind of rocked some of the foundational underpinnings of the kind of SSL and network security across the internet. That was followed by Shell Shock, which was a vulnerability that affected Unix-based systems. So Macs are included under that umbrella. CryptoLocker, CryptoWall kind of continues to evolve and be a very real threat to organizations and put a big damper on productivity and just how pervasive that threat seems to be. There was a very sensationally named threat called Sandworm that was something that a group of Russian hackers were using to attack NATO, and then there's been very well publicized breaches from Target, Home Depot, JP Morgan. I mean, it almost seems like at this point, if you haven't been compromised as an organization, maybe you don't have data that's worth protecting. So, so there's been a lot in the news, and we'll go talk through, some reasonable approaches to combat this.
And I want to just mention, I've got put together most of the images that are in here, not that there are that many, and of course it's always a challenge finding appropriate images that are free to use for commercial purposes online. Although there's many of them, there aren't nearly as many as there are ones that you can buy. This is a picture I found. It was not the first thing that turned up when I looked for security in my searches, but I do think that is an interesting picture in that I think when people talk about security, they often focus on the front gate or the gate, and by no means is that the only thing to think about. There's probably a hole in this fence just off the frame. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So this is a picture that that shows what's commonly called the CIA framework or the security triad, and I think this is really the meat of our big picture context. And I think it is worth remembering that security is not just confidentiality, which I think is what people often focus on when they think about, oh, I'm going to a security webinar today, or attending a security webinar today, and I'm expecting to hear lots about how to keep my data, my IT resources confidential. It is equally, in terms of having your information secure, you also need to focus on availability and integrity. So confidentiality is just what you think it is. Matt, I see your, there you go, okay. Confidentiality is just what you would think it is. It's keeping the data out of the wrong hands. So this is obviously keeping your data out of perhaps out of the NSA's hands, out of your competitors' hands, making sure that when someone leaves your organization, they don't take your intellectual property with them. It can also mean that within your organization, you make sure that the HR information is only available to the HR people, and perhaps, obviously to the employee that it concerns, but not to other employees, and there's regulations about that. So that's what we're used to thinking about when we first think about security. Availability is sort of the idea that your information, that you can get to your information when you need to. And so this might have things to do with like levels of redundancy in your system. If your firewall goes down, does that mean that suddenly you can't access your data? Or if a server fails, how long does it take to get that server replaced? If you don't have appropriate protections for in terms of availability, you're not worried. Your data is not being lost to others. There's not a breach of confidentiality, but it's not secure in terms of meeting your organization's needs, because if a single disk failure means your information is not available, that's no good. And then the last thing is integrity. And I think this is the one that's the most overlooked. And here we're talking about the fact that you don't want your information to be modified without sort of incorrectly. So obviously a database is being modified all the time, but it might be important to be able to restore to an earlier version of that database. That might be part of data integrity. It might mean that you need to know who made what modifications. So in a financial system, it's being modified all the time, but you need to know who changed that number, maybe for audit reasons. And then there might be some data that really shouldn't change. So the one I think of is like an annual performance review. Once that is finished, that annual performance review, needs to stay the way it was. If someone can change it, then there's an integrity problem. So here we have those two examples. The are two examples that I've sort of mentioned already. The annual performance review, obviously that's confidential in terms of it needs to be limited to the HR department, the supervisor, and to the employee it concerns. In terms of integrity, the data should not really, there's no way it should be changing, and you must have the utmost confidence that it's not altered. That's one of the strengths of the PDF file of that particular kind of file, is that PDFs are supposed to be something that aren't alterable. Obviously, there are ways to alter them, but it's not a Word document. If you had a Word document as your final destination for an annual performance review, actually, it wouldn't be that hard for someone to go in and change a couple words. It might be harder to do that with a PDF, particularly a PDF of a scan, perhaps. And then availability, actually, with something like an annual performance review, it doesn't have to be available immediately in most instances. It's really only needed upon request. If it takes 2 to 3 days to get an annual performance review from last year, that's not a big deal to anybody, generally speaking. Your accounting systems, another example of how we would use the CIA framework to analyze our data security requirements. Accounting system should be limited to the finance department and the president, perhaps. I mean, there might be other people in your organization, but that's just in this example who I thought of. In terms of integrity, the data is constantly updated, but we might need the ability, we might have the requirement in our organization to be able to roll back the last 30 days of activities, and we might need to know who changed what. That's why in a lot of accounting systems, you log in with different accounts, so you have records of, it's not just the accounting department is keeping track of this, but rather, the CFO has a different login than the accountant, and that's the reason for that. And then availability, this is going to differ from organization to organization, obviously, but I just picked, for this example, that maybe 8 hours of downtime might be acceptable. Once you bleed over to that first day, it starts to become a real pain point for an organization. So if your accounting system is running on a server where if it goes down, it's going to take 3 days to get it back up, that risk may not be tenable.
So more specifically, one of the things that's always helpful, and if you've attended our webinars before, we like to use some kind of a worksheet or a framework to help organizations think about the types of data and the types of information that they have. So this is basically the CIA worksheet, and so the CIA triad really comes from it comes from the NIST standard 199, and the link to that just went out. But basically, this is the National Institutes of Science and Technology, their standard for data security. And so this is a way of kind of classifying and categorizing your data. So if you look at the security objective, so there's the confidentiality aspect, the integrity aspect, and then the availability aspect, and then you can kind of go through and categorize your data based on these different classifications. So typically you're looking at limited adverse impact, severe adverse effect, or a severe or catastrophic effect to that information getting out. And obviously not all data has the same characteristics, and maybe certain types of systems carry a different profile, or one area is emphasized over another one. So I think again it's helpful to kind of think through examples, and so some of the examples I see that have commonly been used are, so for example, the telephone book. Not that anybody does anything with the telephone book, although they still manage to show up on my doorstep every year. But for the telephone book, the obvious importance there is really on the integrity of the data. So the telephone company wants to make sure that the information that's in the phone book is they can have confidence in the integrity. But in terms of confidentiality, well, that's not really a concern because it's designed to be open. And in terms of availability, they put it on your doorstep, and then it's a physical copy that you can get. That compares quite differently with Twitter, for example, where the focus really is on the availability of the system, because the integrity and the confidentiality, all of that tends to be kind of end user supplied information. There may be some authentication or some validation of the users, but the real focus for that information resource is on the availability. And then if you look at medical records, the highest priority there is likely the confidentiality of that information. I think that's why we see a lot of standards that come up, like HIPAA, that are really designed to help support and enforce the confidentiality of that important medical records. So this is a framework. If you look at the NIST guide, I think it's further down, and I think this is just a helpful framework and a tool that you can use to help, I think, kind of wrap your head around the different types of data that you have in your organization and how it gets categorized.
So this slide, then we're moving on from the CIA framework a little bit, more just generally talking about the different kinds of risks that might be worth thinking about when you're thinking about IT security. We just listed some examples, and the point here is that there's a lot of different risks out there, and part of sort of thinking about IT security is trying to sort of go through the different places where you are at risk, thinking about which ones are the most likely, which have the greatest cost, which is not necessarily the same thing. Sometimes the ones that are almost certain to happen don't have that high a cost, and you sort of can ignore them or not ignore them, but just move on a little bit. Other things that are quite unlikely might have very great costs, and then that's a tough call sometimes. How do we address something that's very unlikely, but also if it did happen, would be really, really catastrophic for our organization? Then there's, then the thing that you're always doing is trying to think about the things that you have your blind spots for, things that are overlooked. So the first example there, I think, is interesting because it was very much in the news, over the course of the last year. It's not as hot a topic right now, but this idea that the NSA is, snooping everywhere and reading, everything. So the NSA reads your organization's email, or could read your organization's email, or has some sort of computer program reading your email in case something comes up. That may be a very likely risk. I think, we've talked to people who say, oh yeah, it's guaranteed. I mean, they've heard that it's sort of a lock that the NSA is doing that for everybody. They may not be reading your organization's emails specifically, but they're sort of generally collecting email, and certainly there seems to be evidence that there's been some program around that. But there may not be anything you can do about it, or very little that one could do about it. A lot of the clients we work with don't really worry too much about being the victim of a targeted attack aimed at their organization specifically. There's a general assumption, probably, I think, I don't have any evidence of this, but anecdotally I tend to think it's probably true that nonprofits are not high-profile targets for sort of malicious targeted attacks. I think, though, the general hacker attack of some script downloaded from the internet and just released generally on anywhere that it can find a place that that we do see evidence that our clients are vulnerable to that. The kind of thing where a virus gets loose on the network and really wreaks havoc. It's not like someone sent that virus to the organization in particular, but it happened, unfortunately, to get to that organization. So here, don't want to go through all the list here, but this is some of the things that we thought about as just examples and sort of thinking about which of these things are the things that most need to be addressed by your organization. I think it does vary from organization to organization. I do think that the last one there, the end user carelessness, is probably a place of probably significant risk, and one that where there is hope to address it through end user awareness raising, training and that kind of a thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we'll share a little bit of Community IT's own experience in terms of the clients that we work with, kind of what we've seen as the biggest impact to data loss or data availability. So, and I think in the nonprofit space, the security realities are quite a bit different from the big kind of splashy news headlines, and so a lot of the information in the security response information that's out there is really geared towards there's big big institutions, governments, financial institutions where there is a real financial and quantifiable risk, that's kind of real dollars, and there's real, there's kind of whole security apparatus and people that are structured around preventing that. It doesn't quite translate as well down to a 200-person organization. That being said, the response is not really to kind of throw your hands up and say, well, there's nothing we can do. It's all it's all too much. But we'll get into some of the specifics of kind of practical and meaningful steps that organizations can take to really improve their overall security. So if you're attending this webinar, you might actually be in this category when it comes to people that are kind of the worst offenders. So if you're attending this webinar, you might be a more senior person in your organization. You might be responsible for technology. You might have access to kind of all the nooks and crannies of data in your organization. And the study that this law firm did, Strauss Friedberg, put together this really good report that kind of identifies, just kind of highlights the additional risk that kind of the senior managers bring to the organization because of their access and their ability to access data. So you can see, some of the scary stats. 87% of senior managers regularly upload work files to a personal email or cloud account. 58% of people have, sent that sensitive information, to the wrong person. 51% of them have taken files, after leaving the job. And so I think, in all of these things, there are lots of technology solutions out there, but kind of fundamentally it does come back to good practices, good security practices, and kind of good behavior by the staff at the organization. I think as senior managers in our organizations, we have to pay particular attention because we tend to have access to to more things than maybe some of the junior level staff. And as a result, I think there's a bigger chance of that data leaving where it should reside.
So this is the last slide of the big picture section. Shows an old painting of some kids playing on a balance beam, and it's supposed to illustrate that there's a balance between keeping your security, your data secure, keeping it confidential, keeping its integrity, keeping its availability. And between that requirement, that need, and accessibility and cost. So we've had a client that does a fair amount of studies with government databases that concern children, and I'm not sure what they're doing, but children's needs, and they do some research and publish some stuff, and so they have access to these databases that contain quite a bit of information about kids, and I think it may be that there's personally identifiable information in the database, and I'm not sure who the database is coming from, what agency in the government it is, but they have very, very rigorous CIA, confidentiality, C requirements for that data. So this particular client has a room where there's a server and there's a desktop connected to the server, and that's the network, and it's not connected to the internet, and the room is locked. So when one of their researchers wants to access that database, they leave their regular workplace and they go into that room and unlock the room and go into it, and then they can sit at that desktop and access the database, and they can do their work, and then when they're done they leave and go back to their regular work, and that's the requirement of that particular agency. And I mean, the regulations that are governing that were probably written 20 years ago, and they may or may not be realistic anymore, but that just illustrates sort of one way you can get to confidential. That's quite likely that data is going to remain confidential unless there's something that in particular, that one of those staff people does maliciously, but it's not going to be accidentally lost to hackers or anything with that kind of requirement. That is going to have that's pretty significant costs in terms of your accessibility, and costs in terms of the financial cost for setting up that kind of a system. You have to have sort of this room, you have to have sort of a separate server for. I mean, there's a lot of reasons that's you may do that because it's required by a government agency, but it's not something that you'd want to do with your finance system. That your accountants have to go into a separate room and lock the door when they want to work on the accounting system. It's just not something that's realistic. So finding the balance, that's a tough job, and it is our job, and that's the point of this slide. Okay, so the next section here is to talk about security culture, and Matt's going to do most of the talking here, but I just wanted to talk about this picture because I thought it was interesting. So I was looking for a picture about security culture, and again, sometimes it's hard to find pictures that are available for commercial use that aren't free. And so I found this on Flickr, though. Oh, so first I was searching, I plugged in the word security culture, and I turned up lots of pictures of tough-looking guys, soldiers, with big guns standing around airports and so forth. And I also found quite a few pictures illustrating what I call the surveillance state. So 6 cameras mounted on the corner of a building, or that kind of stuff. And I just found, and I thought this is not what I want the front picture of our security culture section to have. And so I searched again, and this time I did safety culture, and I found a whole slew of pictures from this program in the New York City Department of Transportation where they're teaching kids about safety on the streets and making sure you look both ways before you cross the street and all that kind of stuff. But I thought, now that's more what I'm looking for, or what we want to talk about in terms of. And actually, when you think about the CIA framework, safety and security start to become they become more synonyms anyway. So my little story.
Yeah, I mean, I do think this kind of the training and the kind of building a culture of awareness, I think is really helpful, particularly in this context, and I think particularly in the nonprofit context that we often work. We had a good kind of insightful comment from somebody in a session that yes, while maybe some nonprofits aren't targeted. I mean, there are certainly a number of organizations, maybe a growing number, that have become targets because of their policies, and whether that's various religious groups, if there's pro-life, pro-choice. I know one of our organizations that we work with deals with issues of immigration, and during some of the more recent issues with amnesty and the crisis with children, immigrant children coming, across the border. They increase their security profile physically by dealing with access to the buildings, and I think there also needs to be a continued renewed vigilance on the reality of external threats coming into the organization, based on the policy and the position that different organizations are advocating for. So as we look at kind of starting this educational process, again, we like to start with policies and procedures for end users, because I think if your staff are kind of well informed and on board and kind of get it, that can really make the implementation of a better network security approach go a lot better. I think if you find in the kind of the corporate culture in terms of network security solutions, I really like the research and work that a vendor called FireEye does. They bought a company called Manient that does this whole security survey. Basically in their webinars, their approach is like, look, your end users don't really know what they're doing, and so you should invest in your security response teams and tools and analytics. And while that may work for a 1,000-person organization, that's just not the reality for for a 100, a 200, or 10-person organization. So it really does need to start with the end users, and that really is just a foundation of just acceptable use, policy, and controls. How's organization data going to be accessed, from where? What is the organization's approach to bring your own device or bring your own apps? And I think it's been a bit of the wild west for the last couple of years in terms of people really being excited about being able to work from anywhere with any device. So I think we're seeing this pendulum swing back a little bit in terms of recognizing that, well, maybe this isn't the best security approach if people can get to their data from anywhere with little restrictions or accountability. And so those are some important things to consider as you're building this approach. I think the expectations are a good thing to examine as well. Often what we find is that there's a certain expectation around what type of information or reporting is available from the current systems that are in place, and unless that's been validated and tested, you may come to be disappointed by what you find when you really need it. So in terms of appropriate use policy and controls, the good example here is maybe somebody you have a policy that says don't use streaming media, or don't visit sites that you shouldn't, but then maybe somebody in your organization is using your organization's internet connection to torrent illegal movies. Maybe your organization gets a letter from NBC saying, "Hey, we detected your internet connection was being used to illegally stream these copyrighted files. You need to identify it and remediate it, or we're gonna ask to have your internet connection shut down." Unless you have a system in place that allows you to monitor, report, and really dig into that type of traffic, you're not going to be able to comply with that with that request. So it's good to kind of start with a foundation in terms of what are the policies for use, how do you expect them to be enforced, and then make sure that there's appropriate technology solutions that can kind of meet all of those organizational requirements. Password policies, this kind of comes up a lot, and there's, I think a wide divergence on, opinion. I think in our experience, what we advocate for is, the use of complicated passwords, and that, can be defined, rather broadly. But I think the key is, the passwords need to be changed on a regular basis, 90 to 120 days. Your password shouldn't be shared. The password shouldn't be used. The same password shouldn't be used for multiple services. We'll get into that a little bit later. The password shouldn't be written down anywhere. So those are some kind of basic foundational policies that organizations need to adopt, just as a starting point for the end users. And then if you're an organization where you have a in-house IT department, or maybe you work with a third-party vendor to do that, it's important to really go over the other things that are mostly transparent to end users, but really do have a major impact into the overall security of your organization. So foundationally, we talk about what's happening with patching, and we're talking about patching not only the operating system, but then also third-party applications. So IBM did a report in 2013 that really looked into the source of threats, and they found that actually at this point about half of the threats target the operating system, but then half the threats are now coming in through other avenues, mostly with Java, with Flash, with Reader, with Office. So there's a lot of other avenues that are being exploited. Microsoft, the operating system still is a big attack vector, but it's not the only one, and so it's not just enough to run the Windows updates. You have to be able to do the other applications as well. You get into policies regarding data retention, in terms of how long to hold on to data, and then I think one of the growing areas is really around identity and access management. So you've got your set of in-house staff, maybe your in-house Active Directory, but then you're having these proliferation of third-party applications that kind of also have different login requirements, and maybe there's separate passwords for that. And so it's really expanded, sometimes exponentially, in terms of the amount of data and accounts that have to be managed, and just what is the policy in terms of for even like the most mundane things, like a person leaves the organization. What is the policy in place for keeping that account active, for managing that person's data, for transitioning that back under the control of the department, and then moving on. So these are some of the things that we would look at in terms of setting up IT policies for the department that IT department is really in charge of driving this discussion. And then I would say finally with IT.
Matt,
Yeah.
Let me just interrupt on that. You made a comment, and we did not talk about this. It just kind of came to me as we were talking. But you made a comment about how the policies for the IT department are, really in many ways transparent to the end user. And so there's two sets. We sort of divvy the slides up into two, policies for the end user and the policy for the IT department. I do think, though, and I agree, but I do think actually that in some cases there may be some value in discussing these policies for the IT department with the general staff. And the reason I think about that is because I do sometimes think that it's part of the giving people a handle on sort of the big picture of IT security can be valuable. I've done some network audits where I've talked to just individual staff members who say things like, I really just don't know what my organization, what the data retention policy around here is, and the sense from that comment is of a person who wants to do the right thing and would like to sort of help with security. So sharing these, I'm not to say getting input from everybody and making this a big process, but if I was doing an IT training, I think I would spend 15 minutes outlining things like, I would say to everybody, by the way, everyone should know that our computers are patched, every Thursday night. You should sometimes on Friday mornings you'll see a reboot prompt. You should definitely do that if you've left your machine on overnight. It's important that we not just that we patch the operating system as well as the third-party apps like Java and so forth. It's important to us that this is what we do about data retention. If you're aware of data that's not in compliance with that, please let us know. Those messages probably go a long way to sort of having a shared ownership among the entire organization for IT security.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, yeah, thanks for adding that in, because I do agree that it's important to have that shared understanding and shared ownership. I think particularly because I think we are moving away from IT as kind of top-down enforcer of policy to kind of IT being technology enabler and working with the different departments and stakeholders to kind of make sure that they're being successful. And so I think IT certainly can help provide some technology information, and kind of broad-based best practices. But unless there's buy-in from the departments and they kind of get why they have to change their password every 90 days, or why they have to have their computer rebooted once a week, the compliance isn't going to be as good. So so thanks for adding that in.
Yeah.
And I think this maybe goes to who the question of who owns security. If you go into the kind of the big IT security space, there are organizations that there's a chief security officer, and that's what their job is to do is they're there to make sure the organization is safe and really focused on that. But obviously that's not often the case, and I don't think we've worked with any organization that has a chief security officer. And the person in charge of IT or kind of responsible for IT, can be a range of people. It could be the office manager, the HR person, a CIO, a CFO, the chief risk officer. So, but I think the important thing is that somebody needs to kind of own the security kind of policy and kind of management and implementation. Otherwise it just won't get done. So it's really important that that is a distinct kind of role and responsibility, and that lands with somebody. It's not necessarily a technical role, and so if you're an office manager and you are the tech savvy person, that could be affinity there. Maybe the HR person in your organization, that's kind of falls under their umbrella of responsibilities, and so maybe they need to be explicitly charged with working on policies and procedures. But it is important that gets tagged specifically to some person for ownership. Now we'll go ahead and move into some of our kind of security best practices, kind of what we're doing now, and then we'll talk a little bit about what we see as the emerging best practices that we're starting to work towards, and then we'll also start answering some of the questions. I see that there's been some good questions coming in, and we'll pick it up here in the next 20 minutes or so. So when we talk about security, I think this has been the kind of our historical framework of our the things that just have to be in place no matter what, and so from our perspective, it really does start with that foundation of kind of a good antivirus platform that's managed, reported on, remediated if there are issues detected, kind of moving up the patching, that's a key component of your network security plan, and backups. So with a lot of these attacks, the goal is to kind of get access to information, or in the example of the the crypto locker virus, to kind of destroy or damage information, and the best way to kind of recover from that type of an attack is actually to be able to just recover from backup, and so having that good backup plan in place and make sure that it's tested and it works as you expect it is a good part of the overall security plan. Then at the very top, it's having a good password policy in place and have it actually be used. So I'll go ahead and tweet out the link to the SANS password policy doc that really talks about from their perspective what makes a good password policy, and it might even be something that you could use at your organization as a template for your own policies. So go ahead and just turn it over to Steve to share a little bit about kind of what we see at Community IT in terms of biggest risks to the organizations that we've worked with.
Thanks, Matt. So in our experience, and this again goes back to that big picture CIA triad, and I saw a comment that the acronym CIA is an unfortunate acronym for some of our clients who are involved in social justice stuff, where the CIA is not necessarily the best best letters that people like to hear. But for the idea of confidentiality, integrity, and availability, that confidentiality is not, in fact, the most common problem that we see. So the most common cause of data loss, in other words, of the impact in this case would be to availability and possibly to integrity, is hardware failure. And I don't know, a bunch of clients, but I would say, what would you say, Matt, 1 to 2 times a year we're doing sort of a catastrophic failure recovery situation where something has failed and the server is not available and will never be available, and a new server is ordered, and we're restoring from the best backup we have. And for that period of time, the data there's been a security breach. The data has been unavailable. It's not been lost to a competitor. It's not been hacked away, but that's what's happened. And the solution, there is twofold. I mean, I think that the recovery has to do with good backups, but the proactively having your servers on a good life cycle management scheme is important, not to be running on hardware that's terrible old, and possibly to think about what can we do to reduce our reliance on a single server point of failure for our most important data, and that's where a lot of our clients are moving to the cloud. And so when people move to the cloud, sometimes they're concerned about the other parts of the CIA triad. If our email is hosted on Microsoft's Office 365 servers, can we be as confident about that data being kept confidential? And that's a reasonable question if you're doing client work where there's a risk that the government is going to, the government is going to make a request for a court order request for your email records, and you would like to have the privilege of resisting that court order. Having the email on your own server on premise gives you a lot more flexibility. I'm pretty confident Microsoft's going to honor any court order that comes to them pretty much immediately. They won't do it without the court order, but they will with the court order. They won't ask you. That's not the way court orders work for them. But if you move your stuff out of your on-premise old Exchange server that's running on old hardware, you're probably going to improve the risks around the availability part of the CIA triad. The second most common cause of data loss, in our experience, is definitely viruses, and that ebbs and flows. There's times when we seem to go almost a year with very little in the way of virus activity, by no means none, but where it really gets kind of quiet, and it seems like the people who are busy creating these viruses are sort of beaten back in the constant competition with the antivirus people who are releasing definitions all the time. But there are other periods of time where it seems like it's the reverse, and the antivirus definition writers aren't keeping up. The CryptoLocker one has definitely done a number on a lot of our clients. That was mentioned by Matt earlier, where once the virus infects a machine, it basically encrypts all of the files on whatever network drives are on that machine, and encrypts them in such a way that you really can't recover them without the encryption key. And at that point, you would recover from a backup, presumably. So yeah, this is an argument. Both of these experiences is an argument for having a very good backup system, and we shouldn't underestimate that. And I would say that when we talk about culture, which we talked about earlier, our clients who have experienced have had the experience of needing to recover an entire server from backup have a very different feeling about backups than those who don't. Those who don't, not always, but sometimes people who have never had that experience simply view backups as a cost center. Why are we doing this? We're just throwing money away on backups. Those that have had the experience of needing to recover from a backup, that was money really well spent, obviously. It's like any kind of insurance, and it's not until you need it that you realize how valuable it was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think the reality is that, losing access to your data, through a hardware failure or a virus or through some other, means, I don't necessarily think it's a question of, if that's going to happen, but more of a question of when is that going to happen to you, and so it is important to kind of think about what is the response in these different scenarios. What are we going to do, if our server fails? What are we going to do if something compromises our file system? What are we going to do if we can't access our our cloud-based database for whatever reason? How are we going to address that? And I think unless you kind of test it and really know, it is a bit of an unknown. And so what we've seen is that we have had instances where despite patching and updated antivirus and all these other steps, a virus has gotten through and impacted a portion of the network, and with kind of good backups in place, that can get remediated and recovered within a few hours. But at the same time, if an organization kind of doesn't have a good backup system in place, in our line of work, if we would call it unmanaged. If we're not kind of proactively monitoring and managing your backup, and you're using iBackup or something else that somebody your organization is responsible for checking, and maybe it's running, maybe it isn't, but that often can take a lot more time, and that's often measured in multiple days. So it's important to kind of acknowledge the reality of those risks, and kind of what is your organization going to do to respond to that. So I know we're coming down to the last 10 minutes. I do want to have some time for questions, so I want to get to these evolving organizational trends, and then the emerging best practices as a way to deal with that. So at this point, maybe the cloud-based service isn't an evolving org trend, but it is the organizational trend, or it's the organizational reality now. So obviously that changes the dynamic. You can't just kind of put a better antivirus system or a better firewall in front of the cloud. So that presents some new challenges to ensuring good confidentiality, integrity, and availability. I think on the availability side, it certainly improves it quite a bit. Because now you're taking advantage of a massive shared resources instead of trying to create that yourself. With the cloud-based services, I think it's now you have the elimination of the the workplace borders. Work doesn't just happen 9 to 5 in your office anymore. It happens at the coffee shop, at people's houses. And so I think that raises some new and interesting challenges to dealing with these questions of security. And how do you meet those challenges? Again, bring your own device. Folks being able to bring whatever desktop, laptop, tablet, phone they want to access organizational information, or even bring your own app where people are using their own applications to do quote unquote the organization's work. And how do you ensure that personally identifiable information isn't stored kind of outside of those systems that you can really control and manage. So I think these are the evolving organizational trends that I think are very good in a number of ways, and it just means that as somebody who needs to think about security in your organization, it is a different paradigm, because you can't just build a walled garden around your IT resources and kind of set it and forget it, because those borders have really changed. So what we're seeing now as the emerging best practices, so kind of building off of the foundation of good antivirus, good patching, good backups, good password policy, is really a move towards single sign-on, kind of paired with two-factor authentication. So that's the 2FA. You're likely familiar with 2FA for your debit card. You've got your debit card. Something you have your PIN code, something and so that gets you access to your finances. 2FA is becoming very popular and very prevalent now. So Google has had it for quite a while, and I think it's a really great feature. You can log in, and then they send you a challenge, either a text or an app on your phone to enter a PIN code. So I think that's a great next step, because it allows I think a greater degree of security for for those resources. So it's not just somebody gets access to your email and now they have access to all of your online resources. Kind of that coupled with single sign-on. So I think one of the big the cloud has been great, and the proliferation of cloud services has been, I think, a real benefit to the space. But at the same time, I think it's created a lot of complexity, because now instead of managing one account, now you're managing 10 accounts. There are a lot of solutions now that are in place that allow single sign-on, so that you just have that single username and password, and that allows you to log into your Salesforce and your Office 365. You can log in to Box, to even to Google Apps, all with kind of a single login. So you don't have the risk of having all those additional accounts and passwords laying around, and so it just makes it a lot more streamlined to administer and manage, because you have that one account that you can protect very securely with a good password, and then also that added layer of security of the two-factor authentication. Again, we're seeing mobile device management really being deployed more broadly. It is moving away from like, hey, it's great people can use their phones to get email and other information resources, to, hey, well, we really need to have some good policies and procedures, and really kind of understand what's happening on that device, so that if something happens, we can ensure that information isn't going to be lost. Application approval. So this is kind of the flip side to antivirus, which is we want to protect the system from bad things running on it, to application approval, where we're only going to allow this list of applications to run on our system. So that's kind of the flip side of antivirus, and it's basically saying, like, we're never going to keep up with the antivirus or the virus writers, so we're just going to go on an approval basis to only allow approved applications to run on our computers. Encryption. A lot of vendors are now kind of including this as your data at rest is encrypted, so that it can't be used if it's compromised, and then even encryption for local systems. That's part of Microsoft's approach with Windows 8.1 Enterprise, where the BitLocker, you can encrypt the laptop, so that if something happens, if the laptop is lost, the risk of data somebody accessing information on that laptop is dramatically reduced. And then the last term is adaptive defense. So I've mentioned this vendor FireEye before, but their approach, and they were actually the vendor that Target had during their data breach. The real story there is that yes, Target was compromised, but the FireEye system that they had in place actually detected some anomalies, but the system wasn't turned on. So there were alerts going to the chief security officer, which was an empty position, and so basically no one was paying attention to the system. And so they'd spent millions of dollars on this high-end network security, but nobody was kind of at the wheel, and so they suffered this dramatic data loss because nobody was paying attention to the signs that were there. So yes, all these tools.
Like the alarm on the front door of the White House was turned off because it annoyed the butler or whatever. That was the story recently, right, with the guy who got in the White House.
So in terms of practical next steps, we kind of go back to have a data inventory, kind of know what you have, where it is, and how it's protected, and that applies to the file server down the hall, and also your cloud-based database. Really, it does make sure you have good passwords. Don't use the same ones for multiple services. Again, in the news, there was the buzz was, oh, well, Dropbox was hacked. Well, it turned out that Dropbox wasn't hacked, but a list of kind of known username, email addresses, and passwords was made available, and so the hackers are just kind of going through brute force saying, oh, well, we know that Bob Smith at Gmail uses password 123. Okay, so let's try Dropbox, let's try Google, let's try Netflix, let's try all these things. And so if you're using the same password on all of the different sites, if that gets out, then immediately everything has been vulnerable. And really start planning for 2FA now. There's a lot of great tools that are available that make it very easy, and it's a great step to take to really improve the overall security architecture that you have.
Matt, if I could add, and again, apologies that this didn't make it on the slide when we were planning this earlier, but something you said earlier in this presentation actually made me think of it. The fact that systems are going to fail. It's not if, but when. Reminded me of the exercise that we've gone through as community IT, as our own organization, of going through and sort of doing a business continuity plan. So what happens when our password database breaks? Maybe only for 8 hours, but what do we do? What happens when our ticketing system database goes down? What are we going to do? And we've actually made contingency plans. I don't know for everything, but we've tried to think of the things that could happen, and made contingency plans, and that seems like that would be another practical next step. I will say, we have 30 technicians and a few support staff. We're not the biggest organization in the world. It seemed like a very arduous task to me. I'm really glad we went through it, but it wasn't an easy undertaking. So it's not like, oh, just do this. I mean, it involved a lot of stakeholders doing a lot of thinking, and but it was, I think, a very worthwhile activity for us to do.
Yeah, I agree. We're kind of getting to the end of our time, but I do want to have a chance to answer the question. So I know, Johan, you've been monitoring that. So if you could share some of the questions that have come through, we'll take a stab at it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and actually, I think what I'd like to do is go ahead and just kind of let everyone know what the webinar is going to be next month, and then we'll go late. We usually are always willing to go 15, 20 minutes past 5 to answer any questions folks might have. And we're recording this, so if you have to drop off now, it's fine. You can come back and listen to the Q&A at the 60-minute mark later. So next month, the fourth Thursday, which is typically when we do these webinars, is Thanksgiving here in the U.S. And so we are going to be moving our webinar up to the third Thursday, which is November 20th. So please make a note of that change in the day of the month that we're doing the webinar. It's going to be a fantastic webinar. The tentative title right now is Future of Nonprofit CRM, and basically we're going to be hosting Kyle Haynes and Peter Gross from Build Consulting. These are two guys who've worked with Razor's Edge for I think 10, 15 years each. So they have a ton of experience. They just got back from BBCon, which is Blackbaud's conference, and Dreamforce, which is Salesforce's conference. And they're going to be sharing kind of their thoughts on what was presented at those conferences, particularly with regards to RENXT. That's what they're calling it, RENXT, which is kind of the next version of Razor's Edge. And I know a lot of you out there use Razor's Edge. Like us, you've probably been wondering what's going on with Razor's Edge. Where is it going from here? Well, this webinar on the 20th is going to maybe not answer all of those questions, but it'll definitely give us all a better sense of where Blackbaud is headed and where Salesforce is headed. So please join us for that. You can register on our website, communityit.com. So let's get to some questions. Great questions, great engagement by all of the attendees today, and we're really, that always helps us to do a better job with these webinars. So one question, a couple related questions really all around passwords. One question was, would love to see some examples of best practice policies on passwords, especially for social media. And then I think related to that is another question from a different attendee asking how using single sign-on is different from using the same password for multiple sites.
All right. Well, I'll take a crack at that. I mean, I think the document that I sent out from SANS kind of has some guidelines in terms of making complex passwords. So I think that's kind of a good place to start. There's also an XKCD cartoon that came out a while ago that talked about passwords and kind of challenge some of the assumptions. I mean, I think the assumptions have always been, it needs to be 12 characters long. It needs to be a mix of uppercase and lowercase and numbers and special characters. All of which can be kind of hard to remember. So I think they were advocating for basically longer passwords are better. They don't have to longer is better because what makes sense to you is not necessarily going to make sense for for a computer that's just kind of doing a brute force attack. So I think the jury is to some extent still out on kind of the perfect password policy. I think the biggest takeaway is that having some variety, not using I think everybody can agree that having a variety of characters, letters, special characters, and having a longer password is kind of in general better because when it gets converted and stored, that ends up just being a longer value and it takes longer to calculate or to crack. And then I would say for social media, so I think a lot of the social media platforms now have some kind of either even Facebook sign on or Google sign on, and in that instance you can actually use the two-factor authentication services or features of those platforms to do the kind of password login and then do the PIN code from a text message or a call in or a number generator on your phone. So I think a lot of those common social media platforms have a sign-on method that allows you to reuse some of those credentials and get kind of get access that way. So again, I think that it's the two-factor piece that really adds the additional security.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, Ars Technica had a great article about 5 or 6 months ago where basically they said that, almost any password that's sort of easy for someone to remember is going to be hackable. And, it is kind of a despairing article in some ways that there's kind of no good secure password out there, that dictionary attacks, the example they used was a long sort of phrase from the book The Call of Cthulhu, which is complete gibberish, but is easily hackable in 15 or 20 minutes because most dictionary attacks, they're going to draw on literature. They're going to find that phrase in Call of Cthulhu, and they're going to, try that, and it's going to work. And so I think the sense is that completely random strings of characters and numbers is probably the only way to have secure passwords, but the reality is who's going to remember all of that? And so I think there's a lot of software out there right now, like LastPass, 1Password, that basically manages all of your passwords for you. And it's kind of a low budget single sign-on solution in some ways. But the whole idea behind single sign-on is you can have very complex, diverse passwords across a variety of sites, and you manage them using software rather than trying to remember them all in your head. And then I think two-factor authentication ends up, sort of helping out with that problem as well. But I think the reality is, that back in the day, like 10 years ago, we used to recommend people replace E's with threes and replace I's with ones, and all of that is built into these into the software now that can hack passwords. So I really think using a password monitoring system, single sign-on,